Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our virtual webinar and social networking event. My name is Destiny Piper and I'm your current president of the ITE Sask section. To start the event, we will hear from two out-of-province presenters, Andrew Sedor from the City of Calgary and Carolyn Sherstone from WSP. In the chat box, you will find links to provide presenter and event feedback. Please feel free to fill out these forms during the presentations. Trying to switch slides here, sorry about that. A short question and answer period will be provided after each presentation. Please type your questions in the question box on the right-hand side. After the presentations, there will be an optional social networking event where attendees can partake in smaller informal conversations and network with other members in Saskatchewan. A Google Meet link will be provided in the comment box at the end of the presentations for you to join. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Andrew for our first presentation. Andrew Sedor works as a transportation strategist at the City of Calgary. Andrew's portfolio includes evaluating how new technologies could influence transportation in Calgary. Andrew led Canada's first public-facing autonomous vehicle pilot, authored Calgary's Future of Transportation report, updates bylaws to accommodate a new transportation technologies, launched the City of Calgary's Living Lab program, and leads the shared e-scooter and e-bike program at the city. Andrew also teaches a course in urban planning at the University of Calgary and holds a master's degree in land economics from the University of Cambridge. Please join me in welcoming Andrew.
Hey, thank you so much. So I'm seeing myself on the screen, but am I able to pull up? This is always great when you're giving a presentation on new technology and the technology is working for me.
You had it there, Andrew. You were sharing your presentation fine.
Okay, well, I'm just seeing myself right now. Oh, there we go. Can you still see?
We're seeing you, but not your presentation.
Oh, wow.
You had it there.
Okay, let me go stop sharing screen or show screen.
There we go.
Okay, we good?
Yeah, we're good.
Amazing. Okay, well, thank you. Sorry about that. It flipped back. 1 sec. Stop sharing screen. Oh no. Yeah, for some reason this bumps out. Show screen. Okay, sorry about this again. Are you guys seeing the PowerPoint? Or are you seeing my face?
We see both.
PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do it from here. Is this good?
You're good.
Okay. Thank you so much, and sorry for that technical issue. So I'm Andrew Sedor with the City of Calgary, and as Destiny said, I do a bunch of transportation technology initiatives. One of the ones that I've been working on for the past 2 years is the shared mobility program, and Calgary was one of the first larger municipalities to take part in it, but I know it's coming to other jurisdictions, and I know there's been interest in places like Saskatchewan. So to get you guys started, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how all of this came about. So there was a notice of motion back in July 23rd, and a notice of motion is basically just council telling administration to do something. And so there was one on a shared bike program. And so council came to us and said, we want you city staff to investigate doing a shared bike program. And bike included things like scooters, other personal mobility devices, but it had some certain conditions. So it had to be a 2-year pilot to see if it worked, had to be owned and operated by a third party. So this isn't the city purchasing something, this is something private sector, and then a permit and fee structure that covers administrative costs to regulate and manage the program. So this basically means that it can't cost us anything and we have to recoup all of our fees. And so that actually passed unanimously. And that was in July 23rd of 2018. And then there was a bunch of subsequent reports, which I'll be chatting about. So before we actually start the program and launch the scooters and bikes, there were some things that we had to figure out on our end. So first, the funding. If this can't cost us anything, we need to figure out how to recoup our costs. Legally, this is something brand new for us. as Destiny was saying, I wrote this report called Future Transportation, where we looked at new technologies, and that was 4 years ago, and scooters weren't even a part of it just because they weren't really that popular. And so we had to figure out how to make them legal. Insurance, figuring out how to insure these things, data. So how do we actually collect information from the pilot to know if it's a success or not? Safety, it's a new device. How do you make sure it's as safe as possible? And then the basic operations of things. And then how do you educate people about how to use them properly? So for funding, the way that we set it up is we had a fee schedule that was based on the amount of devices that companies brought in. And so we handed out a street use permit and said there's $50 for each electric scooter. And then we took in $10 for every electric scooter to use towards education. And then we had a security deposit. And the purpose of that security deposit is if scooters ended up in the river and our fire department had to fish them out, we didn't want to have to invoice the companies every time that happened or anytime there was an issue. And so we basically would just be able to pull from that if any issues arose. And so just to give an example, this is covering my screen a bit, but I think it's 500 scooters is $42,000. And so for provincial regulation, the vehicles are regulated by the province. And so we can, with the Alberta Traffic Safety Act, we can do more prescriptive, but not contradict the Alberta Traffic Safety Act. So if Alberta Traffic Safety Act says, you must be 18 years old to operate a device, we can say you have to be more than 20, but we can't say 16. And so under the Alberta Traffic Safety Act, electric scooters are considered prohibited miniature vehicles and basically only allowed on private property. And so what we'd have to do in order to allow companies to operate is we would have to get them what's called an exemption. Some other provinces like BC and Ontario, their provincial governments actually passed legislation to do pilots, where this was more just getting an exemption. And so the province was actually really great to work with, and we would bring them our conditions of what we wanted to do, and then they would review, add some of their conditions, and then hand out the exemptions to the companies. For insurance, because this is a new form of transportation technology and there is inherent risks with it, which I'll get into later, we worked with our insurance team and they set a $10 million corporate general liability insurance rate, which is, I think, one of the highest in Canada and the highest in North America. But this basically just protects us, the city, if something goes wrong. For data, the scooters are super interesting because I don't think any other form of transportation gives us this much data. So we know where each vehicle is, we know what routes they take. The data is aggregated in a way that we're not creepy 1984 style government, but we can garner a whole lot of information just about what paths people are using, where they're parking, and make really intelligent decisions that way. So the other data that we collected is we worked with Alberta Health Services, which is our health authority, and the University of Calgary Cummings School of Medicine to look at injuries, because an injury study had never been done on shared e-scooters in Canada before. Also fielding a lot of 311 calls, which is basically our citizen complaints. So understanding what people have issues with. And then we did a bunch of surveys where we got thousands of people commenting on the pros and cons of the scooters. So for regulations, we had to set a speed limit. And so we looked to other jurisdictions to see what a good speed limit was. And so we set it at 20 kilometers per hour, which is the speed limit of our pathway system. The vehicles are also equipped with geofencing technology, which allows them to slow down in certain areas automatically. So if you have a spot where you want vehicles to go 10 kilometers per hour, you could do that. Age restriction of 18 plus, which didn't prevent some people from using it. Some people just sign it out and give it to their kids. So this was great, where the media posted a picture of what looks to be about a 12-year-old girl riding one for the intro. And then helmets. So helmets was an interesting one because we want everyone to wear a helmet while on an e-scooter. We think it's great, but saying that you have to, you're probably going to get very low adherence. Montreal tried that and got less than 1% of people wearing helmets. There are some places where they have tried putting helmets on the vehicles, but they basically just get thrown off. It's more of like a hygiene and just practical use thing for helmets. Like if you come across, you want to use a shared bike, people aren't usually comfortable with sharing helmets with other people. So we said we highly encourage it, but it's not mandatory. This is probably the toughest question that jurisdictions have to deal with, is where can the vehicles operate? And we took a different approach than a lot of other places. And so kind of the core issue with scooters is that they're a vehicle that operates kind of between 10 and 20 kilometers per hour. And sidewalks are designed kind of from 0 to 10 kilometers per hour, and roadways are 40 and 50 plus. So they're kind of in this middle zone. And so they don't really feel comfortable riding on busy roadways, and also not great to have on busy sidewalk. And so what we put forward, which is a bit different than other jurisdictions, is to say that you can ride on the sidewalk if it's empty. We encourage people to ride on pathways and bike lanes, and I'll get to this a bit later in the presentation, but we updated our bylaw for vehicles to ride on roadways without lane markings. And so what the lane marking basically is it signifies that the road is a bit busier. We worked with law and our traffic team on trying to figure out, like, how do you allow people on some classifications of road, not others? And given that people don't have a map of roadway classifications while they're operating, we thought using painted lines is probably the best way to do it. And I was just watching Vancouver give a presentation because they're doing a scooter pilot there, and they actually copied that regulation of using painted lines as a good delineation of if it's a busy road or not. So for education, we put out some videos and material. I think the big thing that got to people was just the media. It was super crazy, just the amount of media interest in this. And I think it was just because they were so popular and so visible. So then the bikes launched. The bikes were actually the first to launch, and that was on October 31st of 2018, which is snowy in Calgary. So the bikes got some use. And then the scooters launched on July 13th, 2019. And if you're from Calgary, you know that that's Stampede time. And so there was a whole big thing of cowboys on Lime bikes because they were super popular to get to the Stampede. So now looking at how did it go, because that was over 2 years ago. So the pilot's been running for 2 years. It's now a program. So just looking at ridership. So over the course of 2 years, we had about 2 million rides from e-scooters. For bikes, they operated for a little over a year, and they got 168,000 rides. So scooters were just way more popular. Lime operates in over 130 countries, and Calgary had the highest ridership per device out of any country in the world. We were getting like 10 rides per day per scooter. They were just crazy popular. So sorry, in 2019, we had about 1,500 devices. And then in 2020, we had about 3,000 devices. And so this is the great data set that I was chatting to you guys about. So we're actually able to use the data and understand where people are going, so we can see what the busy routes are. So I'm not sure how well you guys know Calgary, but along the river path is super busy. Bike lanes were super popular for these to operate in. So along 12th Ave, we have a bike lane. On 5th Street, you can actually see here where the bike lane ends. Our commercial areas were really, really busy. So any of the business improvement areas, breweries for whatever reason. And so they were good and they were popular, but there's issues that arise from them. So big thing, user behavior, parking, and I'm gonna try to see this other one. Oh no, I ruined it. Sorry about that. And something I can't see. So looking, the way that we presented this to council is like, here's all the data that we collected. So for user behavior, we had our citizen survey, which got thousands of respondents. And so the key issue for citizens was breaking the law, people not following the rules, people on shared e-scooters don't share the sidewalk or pathway, and then e-scooters are littered all over. And so what was interesting from 2019 to 2020 is we saw a basic flip from bad behavior to parking be more of an issue. And we attributed a lot of that to the increase in vehicles. So what we did do, so we brought a mid-pilot report and made a bunch of changes. Because it is a pilot, we're allowed to be flexible. And so we implemented a lot of these low speed zones in some of the busier areas. And we did see a decrease in the amount of complaints coming from those areas. And it's super easy to implement. You basically just draw something out for the company and saying, you will slow down the vehicles here, and you can say whatever speed limit you want. We also mapped out all the 3-in-1s and saw where they were occurring, and then had bylaw go out and strategically hand out tickets. So 39 bylaw tickets were handed out in total. They basically did blitzes. And one of the biggest issues that came up, and this is very Calgary specific, but people were riding on this pedestrian path instead of the bike path. And so we blasted people with messaging. One of the issues with geofencing, so you can either exclude a device from going somewhere, slow it down, but the geofencing is only accurate within 10 meters, which I think is getting better over time. But if you had an accurate geofence, you could do a whole lot. So any of your engineers out there who are in the tech field, if you guys can create a better geofence, a more accurate geofence for scooters, that would be much appreciated and would solve a lot of problems. So a lot of what it comes down to for user behavior is personal accountability. And so the way that you do that with vehicles is you have a license plate. And so what we did is we chatted with a bunch of different jurisdictions from across North America, because they've dealt with this issue for a little bit longer than we have, and just figuring out ways that they've helped solve that accountability issue. And so what San Francisco and a few other jurisdictions did is this putting unique identifiers on each vehicle. And so if Destiny is riding, irresponsibly, they can say, hey, scooter 3499 was acting improperly, and we would have an agreement with the companies to basically say, if this person gets enough complaints, they're banned from the system. And so that seemed to work in other jurisdictions. And so we're going to try that here come next season. This is what I was talking about with where they're able to operate. So allowing them on roadways without lane markings is a bit easier and clearer for people. One of the issues with speed limits is the cul-de-sac in front of your house is 50 kilometers per hour, and also some major roads are 50 kilometers per hour. And so just designated by speed limit sometimes doesn't help. And so we thought this was a good approach. So looking at the parking key data, so from 2019, you saw that there was kind of an uptick in parking in August, then it dropped in September, and where in 2020 there was just a whole lot of parking complaints, and we basically boiled down this to being double the amount of devices. And then we also were able to survey and get some really good data about how often people could find an e-scooter. And so from 2019 to 2020, even though the amount of devices doubled, the ability to find them really didn't. And so we put in place basically a limitation on the amount of vehicles for this year of operating. We also used the data collected from where people were parking in the first year to establish all of these parking zones. So we converted a lot of our old Car2Go, which was our old car share program that company pulled out. We had micro stalls at the beginning of some intersections. And so we converted those to e-scooter parking. We had these mats and tried a bunch of different types of zones. So we trialed 30 zones. Only 2.5% of users ended trips in zones, which was fine because there was only 30 of them. And then 10% of scooters deployed by companies in those zones. And so what I think the super cool thing about this is you're actually able, because of that GPS, actually able to measure something like this. Like, you know where the trip ends, right? You can actually quantitatively state that here's where people are parking. And so because parking was such a big issue, we asked the companies to basically crack down on people who are parking incorrectly. And so every time you end a trip with an e-scooter, you actually have to take a photo of the vehicle to show where you parked. And so we talked to the companies and said, you got to start finding your users. If they have taken a photo of their scooter parked in the middle of the sidewalk, you got to give them a fine. And so then they would just give them a $10 fine. And during a 3-month period, they handed out 188 fines. So what we're doing for this year is we're going to have 1,500 permitted devices. We're doing something creative that we took from Portland, where we're able to find companies directly. And so it's not a bylaw, because we don't want a bunch of $10 scooter tickets in our court system. And so using kind of the same principle we did for scooters in the river, if a vehicle's parked incorrectly, or someone from our team, or basically anyone from the city, can send a photo to me, and it would have that unique identification number. And then we would basically just send that to the company, and then they would find their user, and we would take money out of that security deposit. And then the other thing that we want to do to help remedy parking is build more of those zones. And because the program has no budget, because we have to, basically take it all from the companies, we've said $20 from each device is going towards putting in more parking. And we can use all the data, and we actually have 2 University of Calgary capstone engineering courses figuring out the question for us, like where should we put all these parking spots. We're going to get about $30,000 a year to implement the parking. This is what's always most interesting for people, is how people are injuring themselves, because there is injuries with e-scooters. There was no fatalities or people in the ICU, but there was injuries. And so we did Canada's first e-scooter injury study. And the way that we did this was looking at the amount of injuries that required an ambulance. And so we did that for a number of reasons. One is we're really interested in the most severe injuries. And then 2, you have a whole lot more information about like where, what actually happened, what caused the issue, some things with age. So just some interesting things from the study. Most people injuring themselves are on devices. So it's not pedestrians that are mostly getting hurt, it's people on the e-scooter. This is always surprising. The average age was 35 years. And so with the more severe injuries too, there's a higher tendency of females to be injured. So the most common demographic of people being injured on an e-scooter are females in their mid 30s, for what one counselor called wine moms. So common causes of injury: losing control, removing a hand or foot from the vehicle while in motion. And so what we think is that one, people could be, taking out their phone or something. You don't have the same level of stability that you do on a bike, so you shouldn't move your hand. And because the vehicles don't have signaling lights on them, we're thinking that some people might go and take their hand off to go and signal and then fall off that way. So this is another reason why we don't want them on major roads, but putting on some of those smaller roads without lanes maybe makes it a bit easier, so they don't have to change lanes, because that is really difficult to do on a scooter. Alcohol seems to be a big factor, and this was interesting and probably garners more investigation, but there was a huge spike in 2020 with the amount of injuries occurring late at night. And so we kind of just got to take this at face value, but I do think probably it's because people might have just been bored during COVID, can't go out to the bar, and so maybe they drink and scooter. And so it's important to put these numbers into context. And so we worked with Alberta Health Services at looking at different modes and the level of injuries. And so this was really insightful for us because usually our injury statistics come from police reports and they don't capture some of the active modes like bicycles, just because a lot of the times police officers had called the scene. And so the good news about e-scooters is that 0 ICU and 0 fatalities, but looking at the number of trips, there probably is a higher propensity of a person injuring themselves, but that injury is likely to be less severe. And this is probably just a factor of speed. If you're going 15 or 20K, you're going to do less damage to yourself than if you were going 40K on a bike. So there's still a lot to be learned. But that's kind of the general consensus that we found is you're more likely to injure yourself probably on a e-scooter, but the injury is less likely to be severe. So safety, we're having the companies hand out free helmets and do a number of safety initiatives. And kind of the big thing for this year is we're moving to a competitive process. So we had 3 companies operating last year, and we had interest from a bunch of other companies. And so what jurisdictions across the world have done is in the beginning stages of e-scooters, there was like 10 companies operating in the city. That's too much. It causes issues. The companies don't even like it. And so they moved to competitive bid processes. And so we're doing a competitive permit. And so like Paris had 10 companies or like 17 companies and they moved to 3. Chicago had 10 and they moved to 3. And so we're looking for the 2 best operators. So we're looking to select the 2 best operators based on a number of criteria. We're also changing how we fund the program. So instead of going from that permit based fee where we're getting specific dollar amount from the amount of devices, we're actually moving to a per trip. And even at 15 cents a trip, we could generate way more than we would have with the dollar per device model. So just a summary of changes, what we're doing this year. So that unique identification number, allowing shared e-scooters on low speed, low volume roadways, limiting the amount of devices, allowing the city to issue parking fines, taking in company funding to allow for more parking infrastructure, and then moving to a permit fee per trip fee to fund the program. So every time we brought this to council, it always passed unanimously, which was great. But then they added a bunch of interesting items for us to follow up on. So we came just with the recommendation of, hey, allow these to operate as long as they cover their own costs and follow all of our requirements. And then we changed some stuff in the bylaw. But I thought this was really interesting, and this is kind of the last bit of my presentation that I wanted to share with you guys. So there was a number of people who really liked bikes. So when the company Lime brought in bikes, a lot of people liked it, but they just weren't profitable for the company. There's cities in Canada who provide bike share, but it's subsidized by the government and it can be quite expensive. So just in capital, I think Toronto spent 25 million over the past 3 years on expanding their bike share service, which is fine. Like there's nothing wrong with that. But if jurisdictions want bike share, they usually have to pay for it. And bikes have traditionally lost money. And so companies, private sector companies tried it for a while and they basically said, hey, these things cost more than they bring in, and so companies pull them from cities. However, some companies have recently found a new business model where if they bring in more scooters, because scooters generate revenue, that they can bring in bikes, which is, I wouldn't say better for transportation, but just provides that alternative transportation option. So the basic equation is bikes lose money, scooters make money, and so you can bring in bikes if you provide more scooters. And so this was just a thing at council a few weeks ago, but we said if the companies solve their parking and accessibility concerns that I brought up, they can bring in more scooters. So if they address parking concerns and provide one or more of the following. So if they provide bikes, if they provide service in underserved areas, so this could be connecting with transit. So if you say you can bring in more scooters, but you've got to provide scooters or bikes at transit stations and serve more functional purposes. And then there's a big push right now for economic diversification in the city. And so we said, if you can bring in more scooters, if you invest in the local economy by locating jobs and research and development services in Calgary and solve some of the e-scooter problems that we are having. So this is my last slide here. So we just finished our e-scooter, e-bike application process, and it is now up for basically public bid. So we have a bunch of companies that are interested. I can't talk too much about it because it's an active procurement, but you guys can go on our website and look into what we're doing. And then we're hoping to launch in May of this year with the two new companies. It could be the companies who were here for the past few years, or it could be brand new companies. That's it. That's all.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andrew, for presenting on e-scooters and in the city of Calgary. If you have any questions for Andrew, please type them in the question box now. And so just looking at the question box, we have one that came in for you. Andrew, how many staff members were working to roll out and monitor the pilot project? It seems like many resources are required to ensure successful implementation.
Yeah, so you're basically looking at the e-scooter team right here, and this is only a part-time thing that I do. So we had I had a staff person who helped out with education, and then we had kind of a comms person that helped out, but it's a pretty tight ship. And I think the more onus you can put on the private sector companies and say, this is your thing, we want you to deal with a lot of these items, the easier it's going to be for you. So yeah, it was basically me, and I was only part-time.
Okay. And what level of use are you seeing in the winter months?
So we pulled them in winter. And we tried them out in winter, and with the current design of the scooters, they're not great for winter operations. We typically even see with bikes is bikes just drop in usage when the weather hits a certain amount. I was talking earlier about that U of C capstone project, and they did something really interesting where they looked at e-scooter ridership in relation to temperature. And basically it needs to be above 12 degrees before you get that spike in usage. So I think we might go with the approach that if it's safe to operate, then the companies can go out and do them. But again, we want to be more hands off and say, if you guys think it doesn't make sense to have them out in March, then don't put them out in March. It is a private sector operation. We don't want to have them do something that doesn't make any sense or bankrupts them. But what we've seen in Edmonton, who's been even more laissez-faire in the regulation, like Lime operated like a few weeks ago when we had kind of a short spurt of warm weather, and they just put out 100 vehicles. So it's definitely lower. Like you basically need above 12 degrees in order for people to hop on them.
Makes sense when you have the fake springs.
Yeah, and in Calgary just gets weather that's all over the place.
And up next, we have Portland is looking to lock 2 systems to try and counter the parking issues. Has Calgary looked at that at all?
Yeah. So we looked at lock 2. it's more expensive for the companies. You need things to lock to. And so if you have a bunch of like bike racks and bike infrastructure, it can be really good. So Chicago did the same thing. They said it helped solve a lot of their problems, but just looking at ridership, I think it hit them pretty hard. And so we're going a bit of a different approach where we're looking at those designated parking areas and then working with the companies to do incentives. That was another thing that I didn't bring up, is that even though only 2.5% of people parked in those areas, there was no incentive to park in the areas. So if you can say end your trip here and you get, the next trip free, I think that would help. But Lock 2 is just, it's expensive for the companies. It's less convenient for the user. And then you might get some issues if you don't have things to lock to, right? And so I just look at my residential neighborhood, which is in the scooter zone. I think you could lock them to street signs and traffic poles, but yeah, I think there's other ways of doing things. It's kind of city dependent, but we didn't do the Lock 2 system. We investigated it, but found there was other approaches.
Okay. Have you heard of municipalities that restricted use on sidewalks and how compliance is for that?
Yeah, so most jurisdictions don't allow them on sidewalks. So it was an interesting case study where Edmonton did not allow them on sidewalks and Calgary did. We have it in our bylaw that you're basically allowed if the sidewalk's empty and you can't interfere with the pedestrian. People will ride where they feel comfortable as a general rule. So in certain areas, even though we said you weren't allowed to ride on the road for the first part of the pilot, people would still do it if it was a narrow sidewalk and a residential road without much traffic. And so I think the thing that you need to think about is what people will do versus what you want them to do. With Montreal's program, they said, we want everyone wearing a helmet and everyone has to end their trip in this specific spot. And they got less than 1% compliance on each one of those things and they ended up pulling the program. And so with us, we took more of an approach of like, what are people going to actually do and how do we make that work? And so we had, I think Edmonton had 500 or 600,000 rides last year, and we had close to 1 million. And they actually operated for longer than us and had more vehicles. And so there's probably a number of reasons for that, but I think one of the ones is we allowed for sidewalk riding, and in some areas that's going to make more sense. So the big thing that we were pushing this year is just like, don't interfere with pedestrians or traffic as a general rule. And if you're in a scenario where it's a complete empty sidewalk and a busy roadway, probably makes more sense to ride in the sidewalk. So we're giving that level of flexibility. But yeah, most people don't allow them on sidewalks.
What challenges do you face when you see some streets, like important arterials, that are not flat? Is that affecting the scooter's usage?
I'm thinking the questions about like the power of the devices. For sure, some of the vehicles handle hills better than others, and some it's more of a struggle. You'll basically be going up at 12 kilometers per hour. I don't see it being a huge issue. That's something that we could investigate with our data, because we can actually see the speeds of the vehicles. So, but it's not a huge concern. I would say probably the biggest issue with our kind of where they can operate is the commercial roadways. So not sure if you guys are familiar with a place like 17th Avenue, but it's a fairly busy roadway. And it's also probably one of our busiest pedestrian areas. And so, and on top of that, it's one of the main destinations. So they're not great on the roadway, they're not great on the sidewalk, yet they're one of the main destinations. And so you basically say like, what can we do here? And so the short solution that we had is like, let's just slow them down in the area. But that's kind of your highest conflict zone, where you have the place that people want to be and you have busy traffic and busy sidewalks. I would say that's the biggest issue that we're facing, and there's no resolution. And there's no space for a bike lane or anything like that.
Okay. And looks like we have one more.
Okay.
How do the fees for recovering scooters work? If a scooter is tossed in the river, does it cost more than the fee to recover it? Does the last user of the scooter get fined?
No. So the way that we did it is we talked to the fire department, said how much does it cost, and they gave us a number. So that number was $325. And every time a company's scooter ended up in the river, we would pull from that company. So if a Lime scooter ended up in the river, $325 from their account. We didn't publicize this too much because we didn't want people who are mad at the scooter companies to throw a bunch of scooters in the river, because scooters in the river is bad for everyone. We don't want a bunch of batteries sitting in our river. But the last user wouldn't get fined because it's probably not the user who's throwing it in the river. It's probably someone who's just upset with the scooters, or some kids who are just out doing stuff. So but what was interesting about that is because we were finding the companies directly, is the companies took more action to prevent it. So one, they would lose their scooter, and then they would end up paying a bunch. And so what we saw happen is the companies would actually like patrol the rivers late at night, or the river banks, and basically remove any scooters that were close to there. So they would kind of prevent people from having that crime of opportunity. And so yeah, if you look through our competitive permit process, one of the things that we have is like, how can you further prevent this from happening? Because it's a super crappy thing that people do, and it doesn't benefit anyone. So how can we prevent this? And so I think clearing the devices from the river, charging the companies is a good start. But if someone wants to be like that, there's no real stopping them.
Okay, and I think that's all the time we have for questions now, so we can keep moving forward. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us today and presenting on e-scooters in the city of Calgary.
Perfect.
If you would like to provide presenter feedback for Andrew, please refer to the link in the chat box. And up next, we have Carolyn. Carolyn Sherstone is the Alberta Manager of Transportation Planning at WSP. She is based in Edmonton, Alberta, where she has worked in transportation consulting for the past 12 years. Carolyn completed her civil engineering degree at the University of Alberta and has a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from Queen's University. Her experience ranges from active modes planning to traffic modeling, and she loves working on multidisciplinary projects where planners and designers have to work together to consider how best to address the needs of growing communities. Please join me in welcoming Carolyn.
Okay, thanks, Destiny. And I assume someone will let me know if you can't see or hear me. Andrew, I couldn't help but notice that you did need to give a little dig at Edmonton in your responses in bragging about your guys' scooter usage. So that was noted. I don't have any way to use this presentation to make any comments about Calgary, unfortunately, but I'm putting it in my notes. So I've been asked to present today, and I am going to be talking about a project that WSP has been working on for a really long time, actually, in the Canmore region, and it's a transportation impact assessment for the Three Sisters Mountain Village. So I kind of noodled around a lot about what was the most interesting and coherent way to present the work that we did on this. So even though I'm in theory talking about our transportation plan, I'm going to spend quite a significant portion of this talk talking about the background of the site and the area structure plans in themselves before I get into some of the more interesting and challenging parts of our transportation analysis. So where is the Three Sisters Mountain Village? Can I move this thing over? Nope. Okay. So this is in Canmore, Alberta. It's about an hour west of Calgary on Highway 1. It's outside of the park's gate, so it's a pretty popular place for people to stay who don't want to be directly in the national parks. It's a community, I think, of about, there's about 5,000 homes right now, lots of tourism, lots of hotels and stuff. If you've ever been to Canmore, this is our development area that I'm going to be talking about in detail. So here's Highway 1, Calgary's over here, Banff and the gates are just past Canmore's boundaries up here. The town center is in this area. So if you've ever come into Canmore, there's sort of a first exit. And if you've ever taken that one by mistake, it puts you on this Three Sisters Parkway, which is a rural highway. There's some residential development on it, but then yeah, the bulk of the town center is over here. So we're going to be talking about sort of 3 different development areas that all make up this Three Sisters Mountain Village development. So again, for context, here's Highway 1. We have some existing development that's in the Stewart Creek area structure plan. So this is an approved area structure plan that's almost fully built out. There's a few residential units remaining. And then the gateway at Three Sisters is kind of a combination, like a grocery store, a little bit of residential. So that development is approved and is being worked on right now. And then there's 2 new area structure plans. So the first is this Three Sisters Village, which we'll be talking about the history of it. It was formerly called the Resort Center. And then this area is Smith Creek. So Three Sisters Village, there was a previously approved ASP I'll talk about. Smith Creek, this is the first ASP for the area. So what's been going on? Development has been contemplated in this area since as far back as 1989. And the first ASP for this resort center was actually approved in 2004, and that was the Resort Center ASP. At the time, there was no ASP for Smith Creek. It was just sort of identified as a planning area. The Three Sisters Mountain Village, which is the owners of the land, they declared bankruptcy in 2009. And at that time, like some of that Stewart Creek had built out and one golf course was built and the other had started but was never completed. And that bankruptcy was basically related to the 2008 economic crisis, as it were. So it sat fallow for the next 7 years, I guess. And then an amendment to the ASP was submitted in 2016, which Canmore Council decided not to pass because they wanted a more cohesive and clear vision for that whole combined area. So that's why these ASPs have been completed simultaneously. So the owner is the Three Sisters Mountain Village, and then the land use planner is Quantum Place. So we've been working for Quantum Place as the engineering consultants. So those combined ASPs were submitted. I mean, they're separate ASPs, but they were submitted in 2021. They passed first reading on February 9th, and then there was a week-long public hearing that took place kind of towards the end of March. There was hundreds of speakers, some in favor, some against. It's like these mountain village areas, new development can be challenging and contentious. So I think if you went and looked through the public hearing minutes, you would see that. But there's also a lot of support. The date for the second reading has not yet been scheduled. So these are not yet approved area structure plans. What are we looking at? So this is the Three Sisters Village area structure plan. So this is a fairly dense resort style development. The vision for it is that, people can come and do a lot of their daily needs right here within the village. There's a bunch of residential development, a mixture of lower density and medium density, a village center that includes a conference center, a hotel, mixed use residential, restaurants, retail, office space. This innovation district is quite interesting. It's imagined as a place where people can fabricate things and then also sell them. So think like a brewery or artisan shops where you can see them being built on site and then also purchase in some office space. And then there's also another hotel and spa district and then an indoor recreation center. And you can also see the sketch out of the transportation network, quite a significant amount of multi-use pathways, a commuter bike spine that runs fairly centrally. It kind of loops around the village center because this central area is imagined as a very dense pedestrianized area. And then there's 2 collector roads that access the main road, the Three Sisters Parkway. There's a lot of grade involved here, so that's why the roads kind of look pretty curvy, because they're dealing with grades to get from the development site down to the road network. And then just for a little bit of context again, this is the access to the highway, the interchange. So there's quite a bit of development here, 2,600 semi-detached semis, 900 apartments, 400 tourist homes, an additional 800 units in the village center, and then 2 hotels, and then office space, restaurants, retail. Smith Creek is more imagined just as a residential area. So you'll see, and again, the way that it's set up is because of the grades, and then the wildlife corridor. So that's where development is quite restricted. And we're mostly looking here at like single detached, semi-detached, and townhomes, and then a school, and then a little bit of retail, restaurant, and office space. Just to chat a little bit more about the existing road network in the area, which I've talked about a little bit, but we have the Trans-Canada Highway, and then this is it's got a bunch of different names, Highway 742, so it's actually owned by Alberta Transportation to about here. Then it transitions into 4 different named roads, but the important point is that there's one bridge that accesses into downtown. And this is going to be quite important, because basically this was our constraint from the client, or from the city rather, the town of Canmore, that they really do not want to add any additional vehicle capacity for the river crossing. The other important thing is that we're looking quite a bit at capacity for the cycling and walking network, and I'll talk a lot about that in the rest of the presentation. But what is currently available in this area is there's multi-use trails that are built through the existing residential development that then drop down to the river valley. And along the river, the trail is a bit of a mixture of paved and gravel trail. There's a few spots where it's a little bit pinched. There's actually a tiny bridge here over a creek, so that's another constraint that we had. And then the bridge, so this is that constrained bridge area. There's a 4-meter shared use trail for cyclists and pedestrians. So generally, like higher speed traveling cyclists will go right across the bridge. And then I just included a shot of what the Three Sisters Parkway looks like. It's a rural cross-section, 2-lane road, relatively wide shoulders, and you can see a little taste of some of the grades that are at play. So this brings us to our transportation analysis. We're given the mandate that we needed to develop a TIA for this combined area, but that the town wanted to really constrain adding significant new car capacity to the network. So to come up with our background assumptions, we worked with the town to figure out what an appropriate background growth was and how that background growth, the modes would change for that over time. We took our internal trip capture quite seriously, trying to figure out who was just staying in these little resort areas, because that is the intent of the design, is that there's quite a bit of opportunity for people to not have to go to the external network. And right now, the scope of the transportation study is just that external network. We had trip distribution data from Streetlight through the town of Canmore, and that data showed that people who live in that area have 2 choices in how to get into Canmore. They can either take the highway, so it's like a little backtrack and over to the highway, or they can take that Three Sisters Parkway across the bridge. And for people who are staying in Canmore, it's about half and half which of those routes that they take. And then we have our mode splits assumptions, and this is where we really got to play a little bit, because based on how close we get to some of the town's goals, it really does change where the infrastructure focus needs to be. Like I said, our mandate was minimize road network upgrades and then maximize the multimodal facilities and provide lots of capacity there. So this is like the mode split journey that we went on. The town of Canmore has a 2018 integrated transportation master plan. Their current mode share is 80% people driving, 13% walking, 5% cycling, and 2% taking transit. Their goal for their transportation plan is that by 2030, on the whole, 60% of trips will be taken by car, 5% by transit, 20% cycling, and 15% walking. So, and that target is globally, and the way that it's sort of filtered down into their plan is based on the street type. So if you're on a local street, your mode shift for driving would be quite low, and then as you get to busier roads like an arterial, then you'll be looking at that 60 to 70%. So using this as our target, we did 2 different scenarios for the Three Sisters Village, and it was basically like, considering how we know people currently get to town, the only opportunity for people who are walking or cycling is kind of those who are taking that internal network, that Three Sisters Boulevard West. So we said, let's just use kind of the minimum of the goal. If 60% of people are driving on that road, 30% are walking and cycling, and then we bumped the transit up a little bit. What does that do to our road network? And the answer is it really exceeds the capacity of the available network. These are the PM peak volumes. Our analysis was like a busy summer weekend. So we recognize, we're trying not to design for the worst of the worst. Like it wasn't a long weekend, but it was like a nice, warm, busy, sunny weekend is where we kind of collected our background counts and assumed for our trip development. This like 3,300 vehicles in the peak hour definitely is exceeding the capacity of a 2-lane road. The volumes are lower heading into town, but we're kind of still seeing the bridge being a bit over capacity, and certainly over capacity for what the town felt comfortable with on that road. So this was our core scenario, and the town can use it then to say like, okay, if this is what happens, we will need to add capacity, especially towards the highway. And that is kind of the opportunity to balance out their desire to minimize new transportation infrastructure, is don't do anything for the road heading into town, but add capacity to the highway. So then you're encouraging vehicles to use the highway instead of going on their kind of more constrained internal road network. The town also wanted to see like what was needed for the active mode infrastructure if they really hit these targets of not adding really any significant new congestion to their existing road network. And the foundation of this is that we also assumed significant mode shift for the background trips. So the town in their ITMP has said that if we hit these targets, some of our internal road networks, the traffic volumes are actually going to go down. And then they're using that to say what cycling and walking infrastructure does need to be built to balance that out. So on top of that, we then said, okay, we can add capacity to our internal cycling and walking networks, but we also need something for kind of the highway, basically adding another route for people walking and cycling. So if we do that and we really, really bump up our assumptions about like, is this going to be a radically transformed transportation environment where people are making significantly different choices? And our design year was 2040. And so we did want to be like ambitious. We know that with the like e-cycling and e-scooters even, some of these areas that felt out of reach before, that was like high grades or it's too far away, people can make a more easy shift to walking and cycling. There's opportunities for like bike share in these neighborhoods. If there's a lot of tourist areas, you can get to the hotel on a park and ride or using a shuttle, and then from the hotel, you can take shuttles into the parks. You can use a bike share to get downtown if you want to have dinner in the downtown. So like recognizing that there really are options for this shift, we put some super ambitious targets on the network and then said, what does this do to the cycling and walking network? Because that's the analysis feature that the town was really concerned about, is they didn't want to just say like, yes, there's a trail. They wanted to say, well, how many people are on the trail and what is their experience of using it? So can we let the road network have a level of service of D or E, and the bike network have a level of service of B or C? And then that will further encourage people to achieve these mode splits. So basically, we added a cumulative capacity for all of the potential routes for people to get from these neighborhoods into the downtown. And that was on-street bike lanes, kind of once you get to the town's owned part of this road network. In addition to adding a ton of capacity to the riverfront pathway, basically we used a couple level of service analysis tools to determine that pedestrians and cyclists probably needed to be separated on this pathway, and then looked at how wide the trail would need to be for both the pedestrian part and the cycling part. And then the big difference here was that we assumed there is a future Trans-Canada Trail alignment that connects along the highway. So then people have basically like 3 sort of options to get into downtown on their bikes. And then we evaluated the performance of those. And so you can kind of see here the effective width cross section. It's lots and lots of capacity for people walking and cycling. And then we're looking at levels of service of between A and like maybe at worst C or D in a constrained part of the network, that kind of little bridge across the creek that I talked about. And so the town has this data. They're using it to start to negotiate with the developers about what kind of infrastructure needs to be built to align with the goals that the town wants to achieve. And then on top of that, the developer has agreed to support ongoing monitoring of the mode splits through traffic counts to start to track whether or not the town is on target, and then trigger when maybe things do need to be upgraded. And so what's next? Like I said, this stuff is not approved through council yet, so there is still the chance that there's going to be some amendments and adjustments to the area structure plan. And then in theory, they hope to only be a couple years away from starting to build out. And so the first areas that are going to be built out are these residential areas within the Three Sisters Village. And this is another interesting thing, is that there will be transportation studies sent in with each of these concept schemes that will help to track that, like when they need to start building some of the commercial sites, because developers often, obviously, the first like to build out their residential areas, but if all the residential gets built out, they're not going to achieve not only their mode split targets, but also their internal trip capture, because everyone who's living up here or visiting up here is going to have to come into downtown Canmore to access services. So that's part of the tracking of what development needs to be built to achieve the targets that are shown in these transportation studies. And that's all I have for today. So kind of a light touch on everything, but hopefully you all got a sense of what was going on there, and I'm happy to answer any questions now.
Thank you, Carolyn, for
Back to my
presenting on the Three Sisters Area Sector Plan. If you have any questions for Carolyn, please type them in the question box now. And so while we wait for questions to come in, what do you think was the most challenging piece with the traffic analysis for the Canmore Three Sisters TIA?
Like agreeing on a methodology for some of the multimodal stuff was interesting, because it's not unlike, you know, the HCM level of service for traffic. We don't really have a standardized procedure in Canada yet for like what's an appropriate level of service for a trail and what are the exact right tools. So we worked with the town on that. And then I think like trying to come up with what we felt were reasonable mode split assumptions was really challenging, because we're guessing. Like with any traffic study, there's an element of guessing that's at play, but we also do know that like the infrastructure that you build dictates the choices that people make. And I think that Canmore is pushing really hard to see if they can initiate change through that.
Okay, we have one question that came in. What timelines were contemplated for full build out?
20 years. Yeah, so our analysis horizon was 2040, which it might be a bit ambitious as these things often are, but that was sort of the horizon that was used. And then the Canmore's ITMP back is a 2030. So those mode split targets are actually like 10 years in advance of our built out. So I think the hope is that the shift will carry forward and be even more aggressive in 2040.
It doesn't look like there's any more questions coming in. So thank you, Carolyn, for joining us today and presenting on the traffic impact study.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you would like to provide presenter feedback for Carolyn, please see the second link in the chat box on the right-hand side. I would like to thank everyone for attending our virtual webinar today. Special thank you to our presenters and to Stephen Gardner from ITE for moderating in the background during today's session. Be sure to watch your email and our Facebook account for any upcoming events in the near future.